Conn O'Neill was the last great Gaelic lord to hold sway over Castlereagh. He was one of the most powerful figures in Ulster at the end of the 16th century, yet he died a pauper. Roy Greer tells us his story.
Conn O'Neill was the last of the Gaelic chieftains. He was a bit of a character. He was the 14th in line from Yellow Hugh, and was a proud Gaelic lord, and he had an extensive territory, probably only second to Hugh O'Neill of Tyrone. So he was a man of massive influence. He resided at Castlereagh in the castle, and eventually lost all of what was Upper Clannaboy, and included the Ards Peninsula, much of the Ards Peninsula, and into parts of Down around Lisburn and Blaris and so on. So his undoing was a rather interesting story, but a very unfortunate story. At Christmas in 1602, Conn O'Neill was meeting with his family, his brothers Tuathail and Hugh, and as the party got into full swing, and no doubt there were the various musicians and poets, and the singing, the dancing, the music, the feasting. Some of his servants came to him and said, unfortunately, that they had run out of wine. And Conn O'Neill, being a very hospitable man, and I suppose not wanting to lose face with his family and friends, sent into Belfast, which was then only a very tiny village, to recover, whether it was by means of stealing it, or it was wine that he had already brought in to Belfast and had put in storage. We don't know, but he sent his men down into Belfast to bring up some wine back to Castlereagh, which they did. They succeeded in doing, and on the way were met by some English soldiers who had been under the authority of Chichester. Those English soldiers then engaged Conn's men, took the wine from them, and gave them a bit of a beating. So Conn O'Neill's men returned to Castlereagh with their tails between their legs. Conn O'Neill went into an absolute tirade. He was furious that they had given up the wine, and he said that when he discovered that they had actually outnumbered the English by 2-1, he was livid. He sent them back into Belfast to secure the wine again, and in the ensuing brawl, one of the English soldiers was killed. So, as a result, 1 week later, Chichester arrived at the Castlereagh on the hill and took Conn O'Neill into his custody at Carrick Castle, which was then the most formidable prison in all of Ireland. This was the second time he had been there. He had been there just shortly before the end of the 9 Years' War, when the Irish lost at Kinsale. He found himself incarcerated at Castlereagh, although his imprisonment was quite was with a velvet hand. He wasn't secured in the dungeon or anything like that. He was allowed to roam freely in Carrickfergus during the day, and was returned to the prison in the evening. But because in terms of the law of the day, he had, in Chichester's view, he had what amounted to an insurrection against the crown. At that time was Elizabeth I. Things changed a little bit for him when Elizabeth I died, and King James VI of Scotland became King James I, but he was still under death penalty. So his wife Alice, who was a very shrewd lady, intervened on his behalf, made contact with a Scottish laird called Hugh Montgomery, and they together brokered a deal, which was that if he could secure Conn O'Neill's freedom, that for his life they were prepared to give up half of Clannaboy, and that was the deal that was struck. So the plan that Montgomery instigated was to have one of his junior members of his family to travel to Carrick, a man called Thomas Montgomery, and Thomas was tasked with falling in love with the jailer's daughter, a girl called Anna Dobbin, which he succeeded in doing, and in fact went beyond that, fell in love with her and actually married her. But during the one of the prison visits, Ellis brought, concealed in 2 cheeses that were hollowed out, some rope, which was to be used by Conn on the given night to escape from the prison. The plan that they put into place was to throw a party, no doubt some of the liquor perhaps even provided by Ellis O'Neill, and Annis Dobbin being in on the plan. Once the party in the jail got into full swing, Conn escaped down the wall of the castle into the waiting boat, which was provided there by Thomas. They then escaped across the loch, where they hid in Bangor Abbey for 3 nights. And the only part of Bangor Abbey that now stands is actually from the original is the tower that is there at the moment, although there's a spire added to it later. But that's the actual tower where Conn O'Neill would have looked out, keeping watch for anybody arriving, for Chichester arriving. But of course the locals in that area were all under his control. Probably the O'Gilmores and so on, families like that, the Rice family, and they weren't going to give up their leader. So 3 days later they were able to then make their way across to Scotland, where they were met by Montgomery's family. Montgomery and Conn O'Neill seemed to have a reasonable relationship. They had struck up a fair agreement. I mean, it was a big price to pay, but then what will a man give for his life? So half of his kingdom seemed like a good deal. Unfortunately, Montgomery was very keen to seal the deal, and he proceeded with Conn to Ayr, where they had it legally signed off, so there was no backing out of this agreement. But at this stage, I suppose, when you look at it, Conn O'Neill had just absconded from prison. He had this charge sheet against him that he had been involved in the death of an English soldier. He had previously been involved in insurrection with Hugh O'Neill. It still didn't look particularly good for him, so Hugh Montgomery had a lot of smoothing of the way to do before they could actually get to London to visit the king. But Hugh Montgomery was someone who had worked for the king when he was King of Scotland. He travelled in his entourage to London when he was to be crowned as the King of Scotland and England. So Hugh Montgomery had some influence with the king and was able to use that to broker the pardon for Conn O'Neill. But another Scottish lord was also watching proceedings. His name was James Hamilton, and he also had his eye on land in Ulster, and he intervened to remind the king that he had already obtained a grant to the land, which put the king in an awful predicament. That the land had already been given away, or had been granted to Hamilton. So the king, in his wisdom, and he was King James I, was a wise king, and he was an intelligent man, and he decided wisely and quickly to execute a 3-way split, giving James Hamilton the overriding say in who would get particular lands. And so the land that should have been 50-50 between Montgomery and Conn O'Neill became a 3-way split between the 3 men. And Montgomery, from that day, while he had to accept the king's decision, he hated James Hamilton with an absolute fervour. Hamilton and Montgomery then in 1606 started to bring over their family. I think James Hamilton, possibly 4 of his brothers, came with him. They brought folk from Scotland from all trades and from all levels of society. They were from the folk who had land and had small holdings and so forth, to labourers. They came and settled in County Down. And unfortunately Conn O'Neill at that time started to fritter away his part of the third. He leased land to the Scots coming over, I think to some degree they used their superior knowledge of the courts and the system to maybe swindle. Maybe that's too strong a word, but Conn seemed to relinquish his land rather too easily. And certainly his own son Daniel brought a case to the court, to the King's Court, that his father had basically been hoodwinked. I have some sympathy with Conn O'Neill. I think the two Scottish lairds acted shrewdly, and they used their wisdom and their understanding of land leases and so forth, I think, to their own advantage. I think that was part of the problem, and also that under Brehon law, which was the Irish law, the Gaelic lord didn't really own any land. He was the custodian and the steward of the land for the tribe or for the clan. Under the English system, land was earmarked. It was clearly delineated. They had fields that were created, and it was measured out. And I'm not so sure that Conn O'Neill understood the monetary system either, because the Irish system would have been largely a barter system. Whereas now we have a monetary system where land was exchanged for money or leased and so forth. And also something that may or may not have come into play was the fact that the Scottish pound and the English pound there's a significant difference between the two. And I sometimes wonder whether he was paid in the lesser value, and maybe that's where he lost out in money terms. I don't know. When he died in 1619, he held, from having held 250 or more townlands, in the three-way deal he ended up with 60 odd townlands, but when he died he had 2 at most. He had been removed from Castlereagh. Castlereagh had passed on to one of the English adventurers, Moses Hill, and by the end of it, really, Conn O'Neill died a pauper. It was the end of an era, although his son Daniel became an absolute darling of the English court and amassed a massive fortune. But Daniel had no children, no heirs, and when he died, his property passed to his wife. So even the fact that Conn O'Neill had an empire, his son built up a massive fortune, but unfortunately the Irish, the family, was not able to really benefit from that fortune. As far as we know, he just passed away. I mean, he wouldn't have been a very old man. He became the tonist maybe in his teens, maybe around 14, 15, which is probably why his father, Neil MacBrien, continued, and some accounts is listed as being the Lord of Clannaboy. So you have the son and the father together, but that wasn't unusual in Gaelic culture. But Conn, when he died in 1619, probably wasn't long out of his 40s, at most. There's some debate as to where Conn O'Neill is buried. Some think that he's buried in the graveyard at Knock on the hill, going out towards Dundonald on the carriageway. I think it's more likely that he's buried over towards Glenmachan in a place called, I think it was called Balmechan. There was a monastery there at a time, and there was a Norman motte, and some of the literature would indicate that was his final resting place, which would look out over Belfast Lough. In Castlereagh we can celebrate Conn O'Neill, and we have Conn's Water, and we have Conn's Water Shopping Centre, and we have the Conn O'Neill Bridge. So Conn's name is there in perhaps what is considered a Protestant Unionist heartland. Conn O'Neill, this great Gaelic landlord. But we also then have the incoming of the Scots, and I think we have those two great stories that are part of the culture and heritage and the background of Castlereagh, and we shouldn't shy away from either of them.